what would happen if every human being on Earth disappeared. This isn't the story of how we might vanish. It is the story of what happens to the world we leave behind. In this episode of Life After People, the places where mankind satisfied his hunger now fulfill an appetite for destruction. Grocery stores transform into gastronomic nightmares. Some common foods reveal an explosive secret. This famous meal doesn't have a prayer of a chance. See what happened when this Texas supermarket was abandoned with all the food still inside. Welcome to Earth. Population 0. One day after people. Now that the Last Supper has been served, in the over 100,000 grocery stores around the world where humans came to buy their ingredients, an eerie silence prevails. Automatic sprinklers keep the produce moist. But gone are the sounds of carts squeaking down the aisles and registers ringing up sales. Hidden among these shelves is one item that will last for thousands of years. But for now, everything appears appetizing enough to eat. And there are plenty of mouths to feed. Microscopic organisms and insects have already arrived. In fact, many of them have always been here. In the time of humans, small levels of bugs and animal parts were even allowed in grocery store food by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. 8 rodent hairs in a package of noodles. 8 fly eggs in a can of tomato sauce. 150 insect fragments in a jar of peanut butter. It was estimated that humans unintentionally ate 1 to 2 pounds of insects each year. Now, without humans to consume these products, insect eggs hatch, bacteria multiply, and animals ready themselves for an aggressive assault. 2 days after people, sugar begins to show a side that's not so sweet. 10 million tons of sugar was annually pumped out of 30 refineries scattered across the United States. Just a fraction of the 18 billion pounds consumed in the U.S. every year. Granulated sugar is made by converting the juices from sugarcane and sugar beets into crystals. But the process creates clouds of dust, and this sugar dust can be flammable.
Sugar dust, flour dust, any wide variety of crystalline materials build up static charges as little dust particles rub against one another.
These clouds of sugar dust become a ticking time bomb. Even in the time of humans, there were 4 plant explosions in the United States due to a buildup of sugar dust in the air. Human engineers tried to alleviate the risks through various means, including proper ventilation and minimizing the overheating of machinery. But without workers around, these safety measures are no longer in operation. Now, in one refinery, static electricity ignites dust trapped inside a conveyor belt. fireball travels to 100-foot silos, contributing to the growing disaster.
If that fire were to continue and reach the level of about 700 degrees, moisture in the concrete, in the aggregates, that turns to steam at that high temperature, they explode.
Mounds of sugary sludge slosh out and solidify like cement.
If the fire gets hot enough, it decomposes the caramel into constituents that will burn. You could have an enormous fire.
Around the world, food has inspired architecture, large and small. Some say this building, in Taiwan's capital city of Taipei, looks like a towering stack of takeout containers. Known as Taipei 101, it was once the second tallest skyscraper in the world and was home to some of the highest restaurants on the planet. To stabilize the 101-story skyscraper in high winds and earthquakes, engineers devised a technology that moves. A tuned mass damper system was installed, the largest in the world. It's a 720-ton steel pendulum made of 41 circular plates. It's suspended between the 92nd and 88th floors by 8 cables.
It serves the function of dampering the swaying of a building. Essentially what that mass damper does is sways opposite the building, cancels each other out, and then comes back to rest.
In A Life After People, will this sphere of steel be the building's savior, or will the mass damper become a weapon of mass destruction? Across the Pacific, at Randy's Donuts in Los Angeles, this whimsical building stands as a monument to mankind's love affair with sugary foods. At 32 feet high, the rooftop donut is one of the largest in the world. The recipe for this 20-ton treat? Rolled steel covered with concrete. But the rooftop icon clings precariously to its perch.
The donut isn't actually supported on top of the building at all. It's supported on 2 rods that go into the earth, and then the building was built around those rods. You have a very large, heavy object basically held up by a lollipop stick.
Three days after People. Around the globe, dogs are starving for both food and attention. This Labrador Retriever had a special bond with his human companion. He's a highly trained seeing eye or guide dog who's accustomed to spending 24 hours a day by his owner's side.
With no human around, a typical guide dog is probably going to start to get a little stressed out, wondering where their person is. They're probably going to scratch at the door. They may bark a little bit. Very likely they're going to start to chew on something to relieve anxiety. That's how dogs relieve stress.
Labradors were often used as guide dogs because of their non-aggressive, obedient nature. The dog's behavior has been shaped by a year and a half of intensive instruction. But the absence of his master is putting his food avoidance training to the test.
They've been taught not to go into the cupboards and never to get into human food unless it's specifically handed to them. I don't think they will allow themselves to starve to death, but it might be several days before they indulge in, household treats and whatnot.
After 3 days, the guide dog's willpower is gone. And once the food in the house runs out, this canine has an advantage over others in the neighborhood. He's the only one that has ever seen the inside of a grocery store and knows the way by heart. One week after People, power is out out in cities around the world. At grocery stores, this means lights off and no more refrigeration. Meat and dairy foods require temperatures of 41 degrees or less. As the thermometer climbs, many items begin to spoil within hours.
There are three elements that speed decomposition: heat, water, and oxygen. The hotter the temperature is within a grocery store, the faster decomposition will happen.
Airborne bacteria and fungi accumulate on all dead organic matter. As these microorganisms feed, they secrete enzymes that break down the once living matter, making it easier to absorb and digest. The process of spoiling is just preparing a different kind of meal for the microscopic predators.
Two spoilage organisms common to meat, poultry, and produce are Pseudomonas and lactic acid bacteria. Pseudomonas creates the slimy texture on top of these products, and lactic acid bacteria is what produces the little bubbles and smells. If you consider a bag of whole chicken, within hours, spoilage organisms on the chicken would produce gas. The bag would become bloated with gas, and within a few days, the bag would burst.
In the produce section, fruits and vegetables are emitting another type of gas, ethylene, which causes them to ripen. As one overripe apple produces ethylene, it triggers receptors in the other apples to emit the gas. Soon, all the fruit is becoming overripe and quickly rotting.
Once the refrigeration fails, you're going to have sticky, rotten stuff everywhere, and that's certainly going to attract animal life.
The pungent odors send out a welcome call to the world of rodents. Rats actually have a better sense of smell than dogs. In fact, in 2006, experts began using rats to sniff out landmines in war-torn parts of Africa. Now, rats muscle their way into supermarkets and feast their eyes and noses on a 100-course meal. Hordes of insects also join in on the feeding frenzy. Fruit flies are attracted to the fermenting smell of overripened fruit. Blowflies are attracted to the smell of rotting meat. In 8 hours, each female lays 250 eggs, which quickly hatch into maggots.
If the blowflies can get into it, then you'll have maggots. 100 pounds of meat could be quite gross after a couple of days.
Mold also feeds on everything. The green microscopic fungi begin as airborne spores. When they fall onto damp, moist food, they produce chemicals that make the food break down and rot. As man's food supply becomes a feast for new creatures, could it be the last days for the Last Supper? 10 days after people. After more than a week of waiting for his master to return, this guide dog ventures out of the house. More than other dogs, he is accustomed to routine and heads for a place where he thinks he'll find people and knows he'll find food.
If there was a local coffee shop that they frequented or a local grocery store that they went to on a regular basis, the dog would probably start looking for the person in those areas. Your typical blind person with a guide dog is going to go to the same grocery store day after day after day, and the dog would be habituated to those places.
But with everything in the store rotting, has he arrived too late? Most dogs have hearty stomachs, which secrete hydrochloric acid many times stronger than humans. The acid kills most of the bacteria, including pathogens like salmonella on raw meat. While most dogs might chase after the rats, the guide dog steers clear.
Guide dogs in particular are trained to avoid dogs, cats, anything else. They're trained to ignore those things and tune those things out and do their job. If it were to encounter strange animals, more than likely it would try to just avoid those animals.
The grocery store will now be this dog's lifeline. But how long will this free lunch last? Three weeks after people, lactic acid bacteria has multiplied into the tens of thousands inside milk containers, which causes the dairy product to curdle and sour. The lack of artificial refrigeration has caused most butter to go bad. But there is one place on Earth where butter survives after people. Deep underground in Northern Europe. Starting in the mid-19th century, peculiar wooden barrels overflowing with fatty substances were unearthed in swampy Irish and Scottish peat bogs. Archaeologists determined they were containers of butter from 300 to 3,000 years old, some still edible.
Because peat moss is low in temperature and inhibits oxygen from permeating the bog butter, we think that's why these products are preserved for hundreds of years.
And these bogs were not only used to preserve dairy products. The Germanic tribes of Iron Age northwestern Europe liked to keep other things in them, like human bodies. Victims of human sacrifice were buried in the bogs, and some believe they may have been pulled out from time to time to serve as honored guests at ceremonial feasts. After people, grocery stores become tombs for culinary corpses. Fruits have shriveled up. Non-packaged meat has decomposed. Only bones remain. In the time of humans, this horrifying scene had already played out in one American city. In 1999, a Fort Worth, Texas grocery store went bankrupt. The owners decided to abandon the market, leaving everything inside. Within weeks, neighbors began to notice a horrible stench. 3 months after it closed, the city's Department of Environmental Management entered and discovered a gastronomic nightmare.
The smell was extremely bad outside, and we really don't have an accurate report about what it was inside because we always put people in protective gear before we went in.
Workers in hazmat suits and oxygen masks began the process of cleaning up the toxic mess.
It was extremely dangerous. We did not know exactly what type of bacteria may be in there. We knew that there were some potential disease issues. You saw mice, rats, anything that would live off of garbage or decaying matter is what you saw. And the report was it was so bad that you could not see the hand at the end of your arm. The flies were so thick.
Each aisle they turned down brought a new and nasty surprise.
Things like the apples and lettuce and the bananas that had already rotted, and you could see where those had been eaten or gnawed on. Several of the milk containers had swollen and exploded just because of the decaying gases. The packaged meats looked like it hadn't been touched, but a lot of it was this grayish black goo.
Now, in a life after people, every grocery store in the world is its own chamber of horrors. Rats have moved from meats to dry goods. Their teeth easily rip through paper and plastic packaged goods, creating openings for other creatures to get in or out. In the time of humans, food was often manufactured and sealed with insect eggs already inside. Merchant grain beetles laid their eggs on nuts in the field. The eggs, too small to see with the naked eye, ended up in containers of nuts, or or products with nuts, like chocolate bars, where they would sometimes hatch into larvae. The larvae become beetles like these, which now feed on rice, noodles, and cereals. Red ants nibble on dried apricots. Cockroaches check into a roach motel inside plastic containers filled with cookies. The plastic holds out moisture and oxygen to keep the treats fresh for months, if the pests let them last that long. And packaging isn't the only way food was protected. In the time of humans, urban legend claimed this famous snack cake was filled with preservatives that enabled it to last well beyond its expiration date of 25 days.
This snack cake has sorbic acid in it that will inhibit it from going moldy over time. Once the package has been compromised, it still has a few things going for it. It is made with mono and diglycerides and polysorbate 60. This helps all the ingredients inside kind of cling to each other and hold that moisture in so it doesn't get stale.
Experts had determined these snack cakes could still be edible after 25 years. Six months after people, the 15th century fresco, The Last Supper, adorns a wall in the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, Italy. The painting depicts the last Passover dinner Jesus shared with his 12 apostles, when he announced one of them would betray him. The masterpiece doesn't merely illustrate food, it's actually painted with it. The famed artist Leonardo da Vinci used a combination of oil paint and egg tempera, a pigment mixed with egg yolk.
Traditional egg tempera uses egg yolk as the emulsion. We take a small amount of pigment and we would spread that on a palette, and then take the yolk, and then we're going to add approximately the same amount of water. Then we mix that with the pigment. The lake red is one of the pigments that Leonardo used on the actual Last Supper painting. You can see if you get this mixed smoothly, you get a lovely red color.
The stickiness of the egg allowed the pigment to adhere to a surface. But there's a problem. Most frescoes are painted on wet plaster, so when it dries, the pigment becomes part of the wall. But Da Vinci opted to paint on dry plaster, which made the colors much less permanent. Adding to the problem, the Last Supper was painted on a north-facing wall.
Milano, of course, has the cold, wet winters where the rain and sleet and snow come down and lash the city from the Alps. The north-facing wall receives a great deal of moisture.
In fact, less than 5 years after its completion in 1498, the Last Supper had already begun to flake. By the 1990s, it had undergone nearly 6 different restorations, the last of which involved installing a dehumidifying system. Now, with that system off forever, how long will it take to finish off the Last Supper? And which of man's foods will last forever? One year after people, produce has almost completely decomposed in grocery stores. And after humans, some foods will disappear forever, like the banana. The most common and consumed banana in the world is a variety known as the Cavendish. Wild bananas originated in Southeast Asia and Africa. They had large, dark seeds. In North America, bananas were bred to be seedless, which made them appealing to consumers. About 100 billion Cavendish bananas were consumed every year. Each banana was genetically identical to the original Cavendish plant, brought from Southeast Asia to the Caribbean in the early 20th century. But this lack of genetic diversity left it vulnerable to disease.
So if you have a new strain of a pathogen and it infects one plant, it will also be able to infect all the other plants. Eventually, this Cavendish banana is going to disappear.
Years after people, insects finish off the last of the dried goods. But many of these pests have evolved to rely on humans for food. So in a life after people, they are doomed.
In terms of stored foods, especially dried things like oatmeal, wheat flour, and so on, it might take them a year or two to actually work through all that material, and then there's nothing left for them. So they'll go extinct too. Stored product pests will be gone, pests of garden plants will be gone, crop pests will be gone because what they feed on is gone.
Canned goods still rest on shelves protected from pests by their aluminum and steel containers. 2 years after people, most have reached their printed expiration dates. But the food inside some of them could remain edible for hundreds of years. Most cans are lined with a polymer coating. It prevents the small amount of sulfur present in most canned foods from reacting with the steel or aluminum, which would cause contamination. Still, in hot, humid regions around the world, canned goods can experience a different fate.
If you raise the temperature of the atmosphere around that can, maybe into 105 degrees, spoilage organisms that are not killed off in the canning process, called thermophilic spores, would actually begin to grow.
As they multiply, the thermophilic spores produce gas that builds up and eventually causes the cans to explode. Years after people, the former guide dog has beaten the odds. He's relocated to a nearby park. But in a sad twist of fate, his several thousand hours of training now hinder his instincts to hunt. As the leftovers of human society become scarce, scavenging is no longer an option.
The lab, and guide dogs in particular, they're not the most agile. They're not going to be the best breed out there for catching actual live prey. A large percentage of guide dogs and highly trained dogs are going to die of starvation. They're not going to be able to find enough to survive.
Years after people, Taipei 101, once the second tallest building in the world, is struck by a typhoon bearing 200-mile-per-hour winds. Glass shatters on the lower levels, allowing water to gush inside.
Taipei 101 will actually sustain relatively little damage, even at 200 miles an hour. But during that typhoon, some of the glass would fail. Water would get forced into the structure in places where it's never been before. Cracks would open up.
The steel pendulum sways to offset the gale force winds. The massive damper system stabilizes the mega skyscraper for the moment. 20 years without people has taken its toll on Da Vinci's masterpiece.
The Last Supper's had a more difficult history than almost any painting in the history of art. It's suffered one indignity after another.
In the time of humans, the Last Supper was damaged during food fights instigated by French troops who took over the convent during the Napoleonic Wars. During World War II, Allied bombs struck the convent, exposing the mural, which had only been protected by a flimsy tarp and sandbags. Now, the Last Supper is on its last legs. A quarter century after People, the land where mankind grew his food is reverting to nature. It's a future that's already happened to one farming town in North America, where life after People has already begun. Years after People, weather and erosion has gnawed away at much of the land and infrastructure mankind once depended on for food. It's a future that has already happened at an abandoned farm community. This is Tranquille, located in the heart of British Columbia, Canada. Here, in a valley surrounded by rolling hills, nature has quickly reclaimed its former kingdom. Today, these structures are hollow reminders of the food that was made to feed thousands. Ferocious winds and nasty winters have almost blown off the metal top of the silo. Rusted feeding stalls and dried hay is all that remains in the dairy barn, where 350 dairy cows once supplied milk. At the nearby slaughterhouse, only the faint smell of smoke emanates from where pigs were butchered and then cured. Around the site, neglected farmland has been replaced with sagebrush and weeds. Today, Tranquille is a ghostly reminder of a mysterious community. A town that was forced to reinvent itself time and time again until one day, all hope was lost. In 1857, the discovery of gold in the Tranquille River sparked the British Columbia Gold Rush. Two families erected a town to supply the miners. Because of its isolation, the townspeople were forced to produce all their own meat and produce. By the turn of the 20th century, the gold rush ended and Tranquille underwent a transformation. Tuberculosis, a contagious bacterial infection of the lungs, reached epidemic levels in Canada. In 1907, Tranquille was converted into a TB sanatorium because of its dry mountain air and endless days of sunlight. It was believed exposure to sunlight helped patients suffering from the disease. In 1929, the Greaves Hospital opened its doors. But residents in the nearby town of Kamloops objected to the sanatorium being located so close to their community.
When a lot of the first buildings were built, there was a fear of contacting tuberculosis. I think there was even a rule not to spit on the streets because you might contact TB through anything like that.
When a cure for TB was announced in 1958, Tranquille changed once again. The sanatorium became home for 600 mentally disabled. In 1985, the site was closed, a victim of government program cuts that dispersed the mentally ill residents into group homes and other institutions. Today, 90 buildings barely remain standing. At the Greaves Hospital, a sterilizing chamber for surgical tools still remains in the wall of an operating room. But now, the only thing needing surgery is the timber-framed structure itself.
when everything gets abandoned and you have flat roofs and you have water and no maintenance, water finds its way into anything.
Trees encroach around the buildings. One has even taken root on the roof. For 25 years, melted snow and ice has collected on the flat gravel and tar roof and then flooded the drain system.
We're on the top floor of the Greaves building. Water's come down through the ceiling, collapsing portions of the ceiling tile, and ponded on the floor. As you can see beneath me, the ponded water on the floor has deteriorated the tiles, soaked into the timber flooring, rotted it, and then moved on to rot through the floor stringers. They begin to collapse, and a hole opens up into the floor, allowing water to go down onto the next floor. It can continue down one floor at a time until it reaches the bottom.
Nature has also tightened its death grip around the main building, constructed in 1910.
What you've got down here, if you look, you can see how the tree has actually wrapped itself right around the steel tread on the stair. So it'll eventually puncture holes right in the side of this building. So outside the building, you've got all kinds of vegetation moving in on the building. So the root systems are what get into concrete, and it'll push the concrete apart, which brings in water.
Inside, nature's demolition team is working overtime. Water has eaten through the drywall ceiling, producing mold and fungi. In turn, they release mycotoxins, poisonous chemicals that wreak havoc on wood. If inhaled by humans over a period of months or years, this mold could grow inside the lungs and cause death.
The ground here is now being, if you will, eaten by this mold and moss. This room will be actually eaten away to nothing, and we will be in a position where this building starts to literally collapse.
Today, developers plan to restore Tranquille back to a self-sustaining agrarian community. But until then, it remains a town on the verge of complete ruin. Years after people, as nature hungers to reclaim its past, what will be the sole survivor from the supermarket shelf? Years after people. In these dilapidated places where mankind came to dine, Americans once consumed over 20 pounds of pasta per person per year. 1,400 million cups of coffee a day were once gulped down worldwide, and billions of burgers were served up annually. Any semblance of a prepared meal would appear to have vanished from the face of the earth, except in the case of freeze-dried food. Freeze-drying is a dehydration process. It removes 98% of the water in perishable food to preserve it and make it lightweight for transport and camping, war zones, and even outer space.
Freeze-dried foods can last hundreds of years. A freeze-dried food was recently tested in a university study after 30 years compared against fresh, and that food was deemed by consumers to be almost as good as the fresh stuff. That was after 30 years. Absolutely will last 50 or 100 years. We just haven't had the technology long enough to test the theory.
Freeze-dried food may still be edible 30 years after people, but the grocery stores that once sold these products have quickly deteriorated. After decades of snow and rainfall, the flimsy roofs cave in.
Plant life would colonize the inside very quickly. The parking lot would become basically a green lawn first, then a meadow, then a forest.
60 years after people. The Last Supper has not lasted. Mold and dirt obscure any remaining traces of the masterpiece. And memorials to human food are on the verge of collapse around the globe. In Los Angeles, rainwater is eating away one of the largest donuts in the world.
In the case of Randy's donut, water is going to pool inside of that at the bottom of the hollow portion of that donut. So the base might fail first, and then the top of the donut would come down on top of it.
With its hollow steel structure corroding, Randy's Donuts crumbles. 200 years after people, Taipei 101, a building that some thought resembled a stack of takeout containers, is now being taken out by corrosion in a surprising way. The mass damper system responsible for stabilizing the structure during strong winds is no longer stable itself. Its rusted cables suddenly snap, releasing the 720-ton steel pendulum ball.
You can imagine this enormous ball falling down the middle of the building, destroying everything in its path. The remainders of deteriorating floor slabs would be pushed aside.
The pendulum ball bulldozes everything as it falls 88 floors. Like a meteorite, the wrecking ball crash lands below ground level. Taipei 101 is no longer the world's second tallest skyscraper. Years after people. No trace of a grocery store remains. Yet there is one 21st century item that could still be edible. Unbroken jars of honey are found scattered in locations where cities once stood. In the time of humans, archaeologists had found jars of edible honey in Egypt. One dated back to 1400 BC. Honey is a hygroscopic product. This means if it's exposed to air, it absorbs moisture, which can cause fermentation. But if sealed in glass, it remains eternally fresh.
Honey will last a very long time. It has low water activity, a low moisture content, and a low pH. 3 key things that help this product not to decompose over time. Given a glass jar of honey with a nice tight lid, it could last for 1,000,000 years. It would probably get a little bit grainy and crystallize, but it still tastes great.
Throughout history, food has united communities around the world, driven science, and inspired architecture and art. Now, of all man's packaged foods, only honey remains as one sweet reminder of the human appetite in a life after people. In the next episode, Life After People hits home. From humble houses to magnificent mansions to the highest residences in the world, there goes the neighborhood.